Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about row orientation. So we need to plan how we're going to orient our rows on our vineyards. And in general, we go to a north-south orientation. And the reason being that, of course, the sun rises in the east and sets in the west. Um, so especially like with VSP, think about a VSP canopy. It's going to move. If you're north-south, the sun is going to move over your canopy. So you want to get even sunlight across the canopy so that you get even ripening. If you go east-west with the rows, of course, you're going to have in the southern or in the northern hemisphere, an east-west row is going to have more ripe fruit on the southern part of the canopy than in the northern part of the canopy, and it can often be like a week difference in ripening, a week or even 2 weeks. In fact, in New Zealand, for the group that's doing New Zealand, you should look at Marlborough from satellite and look at some of the rows, especially like go look at the vineyards for Brancott Estate. They have some older Sauvignon Blanc vines from like the 70s, 80s, some like 90s, where they're doing east-west rows. That may explain some of the style of some of those wines because they have quite ripe fruit on, in their case, the northern part of the canopy, and then in the southern part of the canopy, underripe fruit, giving you some of that more. So the ripe fruit giving you more of that thiol, passion fruit, and then the underripe stuff giving you more of that green aroma. Of course, row orientation does not explain why New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is so intense. Really, no one understands that yet. But we do know that New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc has way more thiols than any Sauvignon Blanc in the world. So we're trying to avoid that east-west orientation because of that uneven ripening. We want to even it out. In cooler climates of the northern hemisphere, we might go slightly northwest to southeast here, so just like this. Just kick it out to the west a little bit by about 10 or 15 degrees to really even the sunlight across the canopy. Going just directly north-south does not actually doesn't actually make it even. And then in really hot climates, we may actually want to kick the row over northeast, southwest in orientation. So maybe about 30 degrees to 210, as you see here. And so this would be in areas where the temperatures are regularly getting above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, or even maybe above 90, because truthfully, when the ambient temperature is like at 90, the fruit, because the fruit, especially red fruit, it's going to absorb a lot of infrared radiation, and it's going to warm up hotter than ambient, right? So we can get 5 to 10 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than ambient temperature. But one thing you might look at in your growing region is how often do the temperatures get above 95 degrees, potentially 90 or 95 degrees, and then for how long do they stay above that? And then if you realize that, like, yeah, it's a pretty hot region, then you might want to do kind of a northeast southwest orientation. And the reason for this is when you're at this kind of orientation at the hottest part of the day, which is about 1:30, 2 p.m., the sun is going to be directly above the canopy, right? So it's not going to be shining down into the fruit zone on the western part of the canopy, right? So your fruit's going to be shaded, so it's not going to increase in temperature even hotter than ambient, right? So if it gets to like 100 degrees, if we were north-south and it's 100 degrees at 1:30, the sun is also hitting the fruit. So the fruit's actually going to be somewhere around maybe 110 degrees, and we might run into sunburn issues. But also, right, when the fruit gets above 95, a lot of metabolism kind of stops. So especially anthocyanin production stops at 95 degrees. And actually, I think there was some research about anthocyanins even potentially degrading at higher temperatures. So but generally what we see, though, is when the temperatures of the fruit get beyond 95, we get less color production. And color is one of the most important sensory characteristics of red wines. If we were to like rank them in a hierarchy of importance, color is up at the top because that's the first thing people see when the wine is poured into the glass, and it confers some sort of sense of wine quality, rightly or wrongly, but that's how people perceive it. So yeah, anyways, if you're in a hot climate, you might want to do this northeast to southwest orientation. So yeah, like I mentioned, if on fruit on the eastern side of a canopy on the north-south row, tends to be a little bit. You do get a differential, and so on the north-south rows, eastern fruit tends to be a little bit riper than western fruit, and that's really only because. And so we're actually just talking about VSP here, and that's actually just because on VSP we're removing leaves on the eastern side. If we don't remove leaves on the eastern side, we actually don't see much of it. There's really not much of a difference between the east and the west. And then if you're on an east-west row, like I had mentioned, in the northern hemisphere, the southern fruit is going to be a lot riper than the fruit on the northern side. And this is even on a VSP canopy where your fruit zone is not that separated, right? So yeah, sometimes you can't avoid east-west orientations. And we can't avoid that when we're dealing with very steep slopes or potentially like just block geometry itself prohibits us. Like if going north-south means we're going to have a bunch of really small rows that are less than 100 feet, then that's not going to make any sense, right? So we're going to have to go east-west because we don't want to just do like small rows and then have added cost just because of row orientation. So yeah, like I said, sometimes slope dictates orientation. 5 to 10% slope is okay. We can terrace it a little bit, which we would use a disc to do that, or even a box blade, or both. Generally, I'd start with just using a disc harrow. If you guys want to know more about how to do this, you can take my practical vineyard class. When we get above 10% in gradient, it starts to get a little dodgy with the tractor if we're going down a side slope. So we might consider changing the orientation a little bit to decrease the side slope on our tractor so we don't tip over, because the two most of the injuries and deaths on farms are coming from tractor rollovers and runovers. So we're trying to minimize that. So we might terrace this a bit or change the orientation. And then when we get above kind of 15%, this says 20, but I'd say probably 15, that's really when we have to start going up and down. Up and down the hill, regardless. So even if it's an east-west hill, we just got to go up and down that hill. And it still is going to be a little bit dodgy in wheeled tractors, especially when it gets wet. So, and especially beyond 20% slope, that's really around where we need to start looking at using treads instead of tires, right? So like a tank, basically tread instead of a tire. And then beyond a 25% gradient, we really may not want to farm it at all because it's going to be quite dangerous and uneconomical. We could terrace it, but again, is that really economical to terrace a vineyard? Probably not. Here's a farm on the West Coast, and where you can see I've used LiDAR in this case to map out slope gradients with GIS. Again, if you want to learn GIS and how to do all this stuff, you can take my practical farming course. I teach GIS in the spring, and we go over how to do all this kind of stuff and create NDVIs and so forth. So what you can see here, this is north, south, and then east is on the right, and left is west, okay? So you can see these are east-west rows, and these are in red, right? So this is like a 20% or over 20% slope. I think this is about 20% slope right here. So this has to be east. These have to be east-west rows, because if we were to go north-south here, we'd be side sloping on a 20% slope. And so you can see a lot of these east-west rows. The reason for them is because of that side sloping thing. These rows here are also east-west. They could have been, or rather, these are north-south rather, right? These are east-west because of the slope, and then you get down on this flat part, and you can see they went to north-south, right? And the wine in here is incredible in these blocks. Then you move across the farm over here, you see more red over here. It is sloping down, but it creates kind of a bowl situation. So it's going north-south because you're actually going downhill. If you go this way, you're going downhill if you go this way into this kind of like crevice. In this situation, we don't have to go east-west because the slope is actually this way, right? And then in here, so this was being developed. This is east-west as well because we cannot side slope, even though the rows would be longer if we went north-south here. And operationally, that would be nicer, but there's not going to be a way to do that safely. So one thing to keep in mind is, so people often will say, like, when you increase plant density, you can increase yield per acre, but that's not necessarily true. It has to do with row spacing, okay? So let's look at this. This would be an example like for Oregon Pinot Noir, and let's assume we keep all of our yield components constant. So 1.5 clusters per shoot, 4 shoots per foot, and then an average cluster weight of 0.22 pounds, which is, I think, somewhere around 100 grams per cluster. Okay? And then we have feet between rows here, 3 to 12 feet, and then feet between vines, 3 to 9 feet. Okay? So what happens is, let's do 7 feet between rows, 3 feet between vines, and then our potential yield here is 4.1 tons per acre. If we increase the spacing between vines here, the yield doesn't change. If we decrease the spacing between rows, the yields go up. All right, and that's because of linear feet per acre. So the more linear feet of row that we have per acre, the higher our yields can be. So the more linear feet that we have per acre, like the closer our rows are together, the more efficient our land use becomes. But of course, as we get closer together, then we're dealing with specialty equipment to get down those rows. So our typical spacing in the U.S. on rows now is between 7 to 8 feet in the newer vineyards because of the orchard tractors. We can go to 6 feet with some specialty, generally crawlers from Europe. Landini makes one that we can go down to 6 feet pretty easily. Then when we get into like 3-4 feet spacing, we starting to do over-the-row equipment, which we can get from France, but it's quite expensive. So you generally don't see meter by meter done in the U.S., and when you do, they're using expensive over-the-row tractors to get that job done. But it may pay itself off, and I've never actually done that analysis. It might be interesting to look at because you can increase yields, pretty dramatically just by decreasing row spacing. So plant spacing needs to be based on the potential fertility of a site. So we space plants out more on sites which have greater fertility, right? So deep valley floor soils, soils that have a lot of water holding capacity, So a lot of those like kind of cool climates will tend to have kind of more capacity for growth. So we'll typically want to space vines out more in generally cool climates. Also, one thing that limits our spacing is bud fertility. So buds actually will start to lose fertility around positions 11 and 12. They'll start to go down. And also a lot of vinifera, the positions 1 and 2 are relatively infertile. So it's positions 3 to 10 or so that tend to be most fertile. So when if we're like, yeah, we're going to cane prune, then we may only be able to go out to nodal positions 11 or 12. So that's going to limit our spacing. Um, Also, the longer that we go, like with cane pruning, we're going to have more variability in growth because remember that when you, like for instance, with cane pruning, you have what's called mid-cane depression, where the mid-cane shoots tend to be shorter than the ones on the ends. And then that means that the fruit on the mid-cane is going to be potentially like less ripe than the stuff at the ends. Um, so generally, we don't go about farther between vines than about 7 feet, or roughly 12 nodal positions on either side. So 24 nodes on either side. Um, yeah, and then also one thing to remember is vines don't compete with one another when they're in meter by meter spacing. I actually don't have data to show you that in this slide presentation. Maybe we can discuss it in class, but there was some good work done by a researcher in Canada. His name's Andy Reynolds, where he was looking at vine spacing. He's done it. He's done that work on various vineyards for a number of years. But basically, the crux of his work was vines don't compete with one another at meter by meter spacing. What does compete for water and nutrients with vines is like cover crops when we put them like right underneath the vine. If they're just in the alleyway, they don't have much competitive impact. But if we put cover crops like rye and fescue underneath the vine, then we can actually pull out quite a lot of water and nutrients from the soil and devigorate grapevines. So this notion that this meter by meter is somehow going to make a smaller vine is incorrect. So this is just some data to show when I'm talking about nodal position fruitfulness. This is some work from Nick DeCouzlian and Luis Sanchez, who are at Gallo. And this is actually also looking at bud light exposure. So as you remember, hopefully from 1104, when buds are shaded, they can be less fertile. And so that's also one thing we need to consider when we're considering trellising is we want to get light onto those buds. We don't want the canopy to be so vigorous and dense that we don't get light onto the buds and then we get infertile buds. So you can see the black bars are the low light exposure and then going up to the white bars, which is the high light exposure. So you can see that like as we increase light exposure onto buds, we get more fruitfulness. And I think what this number here, the integrated fruitfulness index, I think is just essentially inflorescence primordia per bud, which would equate to roughly like how many clusters per shoot there could be from those buds. So let's look at Chardonnay. So nodal positions 1 and 2, there's only about 1 cluster per shoot roughly, and then we get into these higher nodal positions and we start getting it to 2 clusters per shoot, especially in the high light exposure. And really I would only focus on the medium high light exposure here because that's hopefully where our canopies are going to be if they're well managed. So Chardonnay, because it's not that fertile in those lower buds, may not be a good candidate for spur pruning. Okay, so that's one consideration you're going to need to make in your papers is, are you going to spur prune or are you going to cane prune? And spur pruning is great because it costs about 33% less than cane pruning to execute, but it may not be the best decision if you have a variety with low bud fruitfulness on those lower nodes because you're going to potentially have less yield. And the other thing with spur pruning is you're simply opening up the vine to more trunk disease potential as well because you have more cuts per plant. Look at Cabernet Sauvignon. It's even more pronounced, the lower bud fruitfulness issue. So again, you might want to be doing cane pruning there as well. Where we see it pretty dramatically, the lower bud positions being not very fertile is here in Thompson seedless. And this is why Thompson seedless is largely cane pruned in the Central Valley. I know that's pretty shocking to many of you. It was shocking to me when I found that out because Thompson seedless is quite a low value crop. I think it's going for somewhere around $200 a ton at the moment, maybe even less, I'm not sure. But you need to cane prune it in order to get economical yields. Oh yeah, so I do have Andy's work. So this is Andy's work looking at spacing between vines, where he goes down to, this is 2.4 meters between vines and then 1.2 meters between vines. And then he's looking at cane weight, and he's normalized it to kgs per meter row, which is a much better way of looking at it than just cane weight per vine. So if we see here, there is significant difference between the cane weights across treatments, spacing treatments, in most years, except for 1989 and 1992. But the trends are actually the same. But what you're seeing is that the canes are heavier in the closer spaced plants, and they're lighter in the wider spaced plants, which what this is showing is that you're attenuating vigor. As you're leaving more buds, you're decreasing the vigor of the vine, right? And so if we want more open fruit zones for wine quality and for fruit quality reasons, then what we need to do is actually increase the spacing rather than decrease the spacing. We're seeing people on the East Coast for some reason, I think largely because of a couple of kind of loud consultants. A lot of people on the East Coast have been actually going down to even meter spacing on very fertile sites, which if you're making Cabernet Franc and going to a short spacing, maybe you don't want to do that because you might increase methoxypyrazine concentrations because you're actually going to increase vigor, and then the light occlusion that's going to occur is going to increase methoxypyrazines. But also there's some work done at Cornell that suggests that vigor itself for somehow can confer some methoxypyrazines into the fruit. So yeah, but what this is also clearly showing is you're not getting any kind of competitive effect of having the vines close together because you're increasing vigor rather than decreasing vigor because you're leaving less buds, but the vine still has a large capacity for growth. Okay. And then you can see here yields, kg per meter. So again, this is done on a linear foot basis, or whatever, in this case, linear meter basis. But you can see that hasn't changed really so much. A bit of a difference here in 89 for some reason, 1.8 meter spacing had a lower yield. I'm not sure exactly how that's explained in the paper, but yeah, you really don't see much of a difference here in yields, because in this case, we're not changing row spacing, we're only changing plant spacing. Okay. So I'm just going to show you, this is just setting up the next table I'm going to show you, because it's going to discuss some different training systems which you haven't seen. This one's called the Hudson River Umbrella. I don't ever see this. I don't know if it still exists. But what this was a cordon system with downward sprawling shoots. I'm not going to discuss it really because it's nothing we see. And then this is the four-arm conifen. This still exists in some areas, mostly used for hybrids of lower kind of quality and value. And so you have these it's a sprawling system. These fruiting wires are quite far apart, and then it sprawls out into the vineyard. The one you're going to see is a six-arm conifen in the research. So here's that research. This is also from Andy Reynolds, and this is looking at training systems. This is Geneva double curtain. This is that Hudson River. This is the conifen. This is six-arm conifen. This one, I believe, is just a cordon system. I'm not exactly sure why they called it this, the MWC. I don't remember what it stands for, but I think it's a cordon spur pruning system, just typical VSP. And then this is like a Y trellis, which is basically like a lyre. But here you can see cane pruning weights, and he does it on a per vine, but per meter row, and per meter row is really what I want to focus on, because that's normalizing it to the row. So what you can see is you can have a pretty big impact on. So remember that cane pruning weights are kind of like an analog for vigor. So the heavier it is, the more vigorous the vine is. So you can see like this, the high or Hudson River, or what was it called? Hudson River umbrella has the higher cane weights, and then the lower cane weights are coming from GDC. So we're attenuating vigor quite a lot using GDC, right? And that's really what GDC was developed for, was to take out some of the vigor in some of these giant Concord vines. But what we can do is we can grow a nice balanced vine and grow quite a lot of fruit on GDC. So yeah, and that has to do also with how many buds you're leaving as well. The more buds that we leave, the more we can drop vigor out of the vine. So our pruning method and training method is going to have a big impact on vine growth. Okay, and again, you can see now he's done the different spacings down here, and there's big differences in spacing with all these with cane weights, and again, following that same pattern of the closer they are together, the more vigorous the vine is, because you now have less sinks for the same amount of carbohydrate source, right? So you need to spread the source, spread those carbohydrates out across more sinks, more buds, expand the spacing a bit, and then you get lower cane weights, and you start to drop the vigor down and moderate that vigor a bit. And so trellising and training and like how many buds you leave can actually have an impact on flavor as well. So like this is a pretty famous work done by Don Chapman and others, including I think Nick DeCouslian was on this as well. I think this might have been a Gallo project. But here, this is looking at Cabernet Sauvignon in, I believe, Napa, and this is the number of buds retained at pruning time per vine, and then yields in tons per hectare. And so you can see, obviously, as we leave more buds, our yields are increasing, and then it looks like it's kind of flattening off here as we leave more buds, and that's probably a function of bud fertility decreasing across the cane or like nodal positions. So it's going to just flatten out at some point. And then this is methoxypyrazines here. This is what we'd call actually IBMP, would be the current nomenclature for it. But this is isobutyl methoxypyrazines. And you can see that it's a pretty solid linear relationship where this linear model is explaining over 70% of the variability in IBMP concentration. So as we leave more buds, we're getting less methoxypyrazines. And that's probably a function simply of, again, attenuating vigor. So as we're decreasing the vigor of the vine, we're increasing sunlight inclusion, we're getting less accumulation of methoxypyrazines and greater degradation of methoxypyrazines post-veraison, right? And then also, like I had mentioned, at Cornell they did research showing that possibly vigor itself can confer methoxypyrazines in the fruit. So just by decreasing vigor, regardless of what's happening in the fruit zone, light environment, we can end up with less methoxypyrazines. So one thing that we will potentially look for is looking at like this leaf area to fruit weight ratio. We don't actually do this industrially. We don't look at leaf area to fruit weight ratios because it's like really hard to get leaf area. We'd have to like do that destructively and then put it through special machines, and it just takes forever. So what we say generally is we're shooting for a leaf area to fruit weight ratio of about 0.7 square meters per kg to 1.4 square meters per kg. So roughly, actually, what we say is 1 to 1. So 1 meter squared, 1 square meter of leaf area to 1 kg of fruit. And what we use in the industry, some people do use is what's called the Ravaz index as kind of like an analog for the leaf area to fruit weight ratios. Because so you can see here from this work done by again Gallo folks, you can see this is on the y-axis. This is the Ravaz index, which is the fruit weight to pruning weight ratio over, this is the x-axis here, and this is that leaf area to crop weight ratio. So this area here, so in this research they're saying, all right, we want to get to at least 22 bricks, okay? And we're getting to 22 bricks pretty consistently when we're between this leaf area of 0.7 to 1.4 meters squared of leaf to kg of fruit. And then you put that over here, and then it lines up with, you create this box, and it lines up with about 5 to 10 in the crop weight to pruning weight ratio, right? So that's where that figure comes from. So if you read Sunlight into Wine from Richard Smart, and he talks about the Ravaz index, and he's like, yeah, you should be shooting for this 5 to 10, and that's a balanced grapevine. That's where that number comes from. We'll talk about that more when we talk about yields and balance. But anyways, when we're making trellis decisions, training decisions, that's one thing we need to consider is like how many buds are we going to leave in order to achieve balance and some kind of like potentially like a Ravaz index value of 5 to 10. I should mention the Ravaz index is kind of an oversimplification and maybe not the best metric for balance, but it is something that is used. One thing about the Ravaz index also to keep in mind is that it was done, the research on this was done in warm climates, and it's really kind of based off that one paper. So some folks say that maybe in cooler climates we should be shooting for Ravaz indices of about 3 to 6. Again, remember it's fruit weight to pruning weight, so this is saying have less fruit because it's a cooler climate and we're getting less photosynthesis, less sugar loading, so we need to hang less fruit. All right, so now we're going to talk about site prep and just go through quickly how to actually plant a vineyard.